we have Father Luke Rabee Toumi, who's an MD and PhD as well. He's assistant priest at Saints Peter and Paul Antiochian Orthodox Church in Potomac, Maryland, and his topic will be an iconic phronema for ethics, medical ethics in the world of aliens.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to take just 1 second to open my presentation. So as you see, the topic that I'm talking about is how can we think in the terms that Dr. Hani was mentioning just a minute ago, how can we be followers of Christ, who is the true healer? And I think that we have so much to do when it comes to the health system and how we can change the culture of medicine. So what I'm doing is to take the theology of the Orthodox Church and try to apply this to the general culture of medicine. And I think we have something to offer to the general practice of medicine and healthcare. I put it under iconic phronema because phronema is a word that means more the mindset. So we need to have the real mindset so that we can change the culture of medicine. And in a world that is full of aliens, so no matter, because of the diversity that we live in right now, so we are more aliens to each other than we are really friends in some ways. The reason I got here, this is part of my dissertation, but the argument is very simple, that we as Orthodox Christians have so much to offer to the world right now, and it's our responsibility to find the common ground with other value systems, whether they are religious or non-religious. And the middle ground would start from that same experience, that we are sick, we are mortal, we suffer, even if it's not now, but at some point we're going to suffer because of sickness, because of growing old. And then that experience would give us the common ground with other value systems, because we all suffer the same, we all die the same, we are all mortal no matter where our background is. I will start with a story that a friend of mine who is an anesthesiologist in UPMC, and he's an Orthodox Christian, and I one time was asking him how your faith is affecting your practice of anesthesiology. And his example was so powerful that it was really going along the lines of my dissertation, and he gave me that kind of validation from the practical perspective. And he said, when I go to the booth where the patient is waiting for her surgery, trying to take the informed consent from her, the first thing, I sit down, I hold her hand, I say, and I tell her, thank you very much for entrusting your body to me. I will do everything possible to take care of you while you're asleep. And as you might imagine, this would change the entire atmosphere. Rather than asking for the informed consent and you're going to have, possibly you'll have bleeding, infection, or die because of the anesthesiology, but he changed the whole entire atmosphere. And by thanking the patient for her trust, that relationship is at a different level, no matter where this patient is coming from, and no matter what value system she has, and whether she's religious or not. But by having this doctor who appreciates the suffering that she might be going through because of the surgery and because of waiting for the surgery, he was able to start the healing process even before the surgery, because he could appreciate what she was going through. So now I'm not going to use elaborate things, but I want you to visualize the middle ground that I'm trying to explain to you guys. The icon stands between two different realities. And what the icon does is the bridge between these two realities. The reality that is depicted on the icon itself is eschatological. So we're talking about Christ as glorified, or the saints who are glorified. So that's why we depict them on icons. That's the reality on the other side. But the reality on this side of the icon is that we are broken. We are humans, we are fallen, and that's the reality that stands in front of the icon. And what the icon does is it shows us that there is a way of moving from one side to the other. It's a window that shows us what is waiting for us, but it's also a bridge, if we understand the theology behind it, that there is a way for us to get from this side to the other side. So these are the starting points. What is waiting for us in the eschatology is the image of God and the likeness that we are created according to which. So we are created in the image of God that is waiting for us, and we are invited to become in the likeness of God. So this is the way Orthodox theology understands the image of and likeness. So we are already having the image, probably sometimes with a lot of dust, but we are invited to become more like God when we are growing spiritually. So that's what is waiting for us on the other side. What is here is our fallen humanity. So the icon stands there and recognizes that the person who is standing here is broken and is sinful and is away from God, and he needs to be invited to the other side. And why we depict icons altogether? Because Christ was incarnated. So he became a human for us to move from one side to the other. Now, these three dimensions of the icon, or three realities on the icon, the one here, the eschatological one, and the invitation that comes between the two, actually align with the three functions of Christ. These are old functions that were at the time of Eusebius of Caesarea, but also Calvin at some point brought them back to the theological talk, which is that Christ is the king, and he is the prophet, and he is the priest. And these align with these three things. So he is the king because he is the image. He is the original image of the human being. This is our aspiration, to become like him. And he is the king because he's the creator. But also prophecy is about our reality as humans. This started with the prophets in the Old Testament, but it continues in Christ himself, who announced the word of God. He is the word of God, but the prophets also in the Old Testament announced the word of God. And the word of God in prophecy is not telling the future, it's actually telling the reality, which is that you humans, his own people, the chosen people, you are broken, you are dead because you are separated from God, and your only way to come back to God is to align yourself with his way of living. So that's what the prophets told them. You were in Egypt, you were invited, you were given food from God, and your only way to survive, to live the true life, is to come to the true source of life, which is God. And this is what Christ did physically, that he was able to bridge that gap. And through his priesthood, and what the priesthood is actually about, is bringing this broken reality to the eschatological reality. Because this is what we do in the liturgy. We bring our physical product, the bread and wine, and as a representation of our lives, and we bring it back to God. So the priesthood is about offering what is broken to God in the eschatology. And these are the relationships that we see in the icon. Now, what the Kinghood of Christ teaches us, now that we will move to more practical level at the human level, that because Christ is the king, we can recognize the dignity of the human being, because all of us are created according to his image and invited to be in his likeness, no matter which value system we belong to, no matter what religions, because it's Adam who was invited, Adam who was created in the image and likeness, and Adam is not a name. Adam is the soil and the dust of the earth, so it's every human being is in the image and invited to be in the likeness. So that emphasizes the human dignity no matter which value system we belong to. The prophecy of Christ emphasizes that as human beings we are vulnerable and broken. And we are vulnerable not because of our social context, not because we are poor or we have mental disabilities and stuff like this. We are vulnerable because we are ontologically vulnerable, because we are mortal. So we're going to die anyway. We are vulnerable because we are mortal. We're not vulnerable because we don't have decision-making abilities. It's just because we are dying, and because someone is mortal, might use their greed and their human abilities and their authority to force other people to do something that they don't want. So that's part of our mortality. Because I am afraid of my mortality, I can use you for my benefit. So vulnerability is actually in the with the person who is abusing their authority and in the person who is being abused. And the priesthood of Christ emphasizes that invitation that happens between the two realities. And that's actually very clear in the icon, not in this icon specifically, but you can see the dimensions, the architectural dimensions in the icon, that they are open to the person. So they are centered in the person who's standing in front of the icon rather than they centered in the infinity. So there's an invitation always depicted on the icon. It depends on the person who's standing there if they are able to see and look and understand that invitation and really extend that invitation to the entire world. And this person cannot do that on their own. I will speak about that in a bit. It's not an individual. The individual, because of the place of the icon, it's in the community. So the community is standing in front of the icon and recognizes that there's an invitation and that we have to work on that invitation by extending it to the entire world. Now, because of the way we understand dignity as coming from God rather than it's an entitlement for us, we haven't done anything to be treated with dignity from the God side because He's the one who created us. We haven't done anything good. So is it more like a gift or an entitlement? And I think most of the time when we talk about human dignity in medical ethics, that we talk about it as an entitlement. So I'm entitled to be treated with dignity, while if we understand it correctly, even without religious perspective, it's more a gift than an entitlement. So dignity, if we can imagine a place where a person who was just been born, taken into slavery for the entire lifetime, they are not able to understand their dignity. They cannot really have a self-esteem. But that does not mean that they don't have dignity, right? So their human dignity is still there. It's not being appreciated, and the person himself or herself are not really able to see their dignity because they are treated as slaves for their entire life. So we can see that dignity itself is a gift, is a social gift. Because if the community was not able to treat these people with dignity, they would not feel that they are dignified human beings. So that's where the dimension of gift and human dignity. We don't have human dignity as entitlement. It's more a gift from the society that we live in. And as long as that society is given, so it shifts the way we look at human dignity. Rather than I ask to be treated as dignified person, we as a community have an interest to treat everyone with dignity because it's a gift from the society rather than the opposite way that I demand dignity from the society. Now, the human vulnerability, I mentioned that it's about our mortality. We are all mortal anyway. So it's not about our social environment. It's not about our social circumstances that I am vulnerable because I am black, I am vulnerable because I have mental disabilities and stuff. Every one of us is vulnerable. And that would have applications at the level of doctors because they most of the time forget that they are vulnerable as much as their patients are. The third one is the hospitality of Christ. What he did actually, hospitality in the Greek meaning, it does not show in English, but it's more in the Greek. It's the philoxenia, which means the love of the stranger. And this is what Christ did. He loved us when we were strangers. He came to us and took our body when we were strangers so that we become friends. So it's actually the initiation comes from Christ as the hospitable host for us to go back to his kingdom. So he is our host in some ways, but we also are his hosts in other ways because he took our own body. So we almost hosted him, but he was our guest, and we are his guests in the eschatology. So in reality, we are his hosts, and he is our guest. And in eschatology, he is the host, and we are his guests. So we're switching the concepts in a way that's the relationship we want to do to be healed. We have to be hospitable like Christ so that we can heal the people who are suffering. Now, if human dignity is a gift, the answer is gratitude. It's not entitlement. So how do we appreciate dignity? So if I have, and here you might be surprised, gratitude is not from the side of the patient. It's not the patient who should be grateful to the doctor because he should be, right? This is by default. Someone is offering me something good and helping me heal. but it's actually the gratitude from the other side. The doctor has to be grateful to the patient. Like my friend who was thankful for the trust that the patient gave him before the surgery. But also, if we think about how many patients were mistreated, like the DAX example that we had this morning, how many patients have been mistreated for us to know more about medicine? How many patients were, in the Nazi time, for instance, were researched upon without their consent, and we know more because of them? And medicine does not appreciate them. And in the history of medicine, there were so many doctors who were charlatans. They did not know anything about medicine, and they experimented, and they did surgeries without anesthesiology, and still, because of them, we know more. And because of the patients who suffered so much, we know more. So it's medicine as an institution, as an enterprise, has to acknowledge that we are here because of so many people. The other more practical dimension of this is when we take hypertension medication, let's say here, to verify that it's a safe medication, to me, it was experimented on someone who is faceless for me now, probably in another continent, to make sure that this medication was safe. But I take it mindlessly. I don't recognize that so many people had to take this medication before it was proven effective and safe for me to take. So gratitude has to play more in the culture of medicine. That now in psychology it's playing more because it's for our well-being and all these stuff. But also if we think about it from a cultural perspective, that in medicine there's a lot less gratitude that has to be infused in the way we train doctors so that they can feel more with their patients who are suffering. Now, the other thing that Dr. Hani mentioned, human vulnerability, is our brokenness, our mortality. And what Christ did to heal it was he suffered with us. He came and he died and he was crucified and then resurrected, because his vulnerability was saving vulnerability. Because his vulnerability was out of love, so that he could rise from among the dead. So vulnerability here, to heal our mortality, is through compassion, which is similar to the compassion, the suffering of Christ. And because compassion is, as a word, means suffering with. And this is what Christ did. That's why he was able to heal our mortality and bring us back to God. And the hospitality that I just mentioned, taking one side to the other, and the hospitality of Christ, and it's funny that hospital and hospice are coming from the same hospitality, because it means that someone is standing with solidarity with someone. This someone is a faceless person, because Christ came in a specific historical moment and showed solidarity with all humans. He suffered with them, and he left them with that saving providence. And now everyone has the choice to be involved in that providence or not. And that's what solidarity does. It's faceless in some ways, but it's a choice of those people who choose to be hospitable to the different other. And if we can build health systems that are solidaristic in a way that is hospitable, that knows that someone is suffering, and that we can heal them by being compassionate and by being by showing gratitude, then we can change the culture of medicine. So these are the concepts that I think would be the middle ground with other value systems. That gratitude, compassion, and solidarity can change the way we think about medicine and the way we practice medicine and build systems around these concepts. So I will go through some of the details, but I would leave more time for questions. That the iconic Phronema cannot only help us as Orthodox to face the innovations of medicine, but also can lead us in a way to engage the world outside. Because if we believe that we have a universal and Catholic mission, then we have to know how to engage with the different other. The issue is so far what has been done in medical ethics among Orthodox is that how different we are. But we haven't done any work to see how similar we are and what is our mission in the medical world today. I think this is what the shortcoming is so far in Orthodox theology and Orthodox bioethics, that we haven't done much to say, if we believe that Christ came to heal the entire humanity, then where is that applicable now? And we haven't done that. We just think about how different we are, how we would think about the person and abortion and end of life and all these stuff, that we are different. But what the similarities are, what is our mission now in medicine? And how practitioners should change from the inside the practice of medicine and the way we build systems around healthcare. And so see, the hospitality of Christ is the one that is, so at some point Adam was the microcosm. He was the one who was intended to move the created world to the creator. But Adam failed. Now Christ is the microcosm. He is the one who is going to move the invitation along and say, now that you are a broken world, I will bring you back to God. And that's the hospitality that would heal the entire humanity. And that's how we can use it in medical ethics now. And the importance of hospitality throughout the Christian tradition, not only in the biblical texts, that we welcome one another because Christ welcomed us. So the hospitality of Christ even started very early, because we know that we were strangers at some point, and he is the one who invited us. So we have to use that concept more in medical ethics. And so do not forget to entertain strangers, because strangers were angels at some point. So that's why we are in a world that we're not only moral strangers with outsiders. And I want to emphasize this because some Orthodox bioethicists emphasize that we are moral strangers across our beliefs with other denominations or other religions or secular ideas. We're not moral strangers, we are strangers. Because what Adam and Eve did, they were taken from each other, but when they failed and disobeyed God, they became strangers to each other. So they are absolute strangers, and we are absolute strangers. Even if we belong to the same community, we are still strangers. We are trying to get closer to each other and God. And you probably recognize that image of the circle, and that God is in the center, and everyone is trying to get closer to God. And the closer you get to God, the closer you get to the others. So we are strangers, but we are trying to become friends to each other and to God. So we are not moral strangers in the sense that we have different rational ideas and that we disagree with this community, with that community. We are absolute strangers. And what we have to do is to be hospitable to each other so that we can recognize two things. When we are hospitable persons, I have to stop very soon because I'm really interested in your questions. In hospitality, so imagine you are in the middle of nowhere. And there's a tent, and someone is knocking at your door and coming into you. That's the original meaning of hospitality. You love the stranger who is stranded somewhere where they don't have access to anything. Two things happen in there. The first is the host recognizes that the stranger has dignity. He's a valuable person. That's why they move to help them. And that they are vulnerable where they are. So the host recognizes two things, the vulnerability. So hospitality means actually to recognize the vulnerability and the dignity of the other person in our mental space and in our physical space. The other thing, why the host is doing this, because he recognizes or she recognizes that he is vulnerable and that he has dignity, and he wishes to be treated with the same hospitality if he's stranded in the same position. So actually hospitality plays the two ways. Hospitality, the host and the guest recognize that they are vulnerable and they are broken and they are dignified people. And so they have to be treated in a certain way. Now, and hospice, the word that, this is the second point, means the unity of the host and the guest at the same time. And that's why we have to use it more often in healthcare. And hospitality in medical care, and that's a very interesting point, and I wish you can see how this is applicable in clinical practice. The hospitality works in both sides for physician and patients. First, the patient is coming to a strange environment of medicine. He comes to the hospital for any reason. This is a strange place. And by the way we use in the common language now that the patient is a customer, or that he is shopping around for providers, is meaningless, because no one chooses to be a patient in the first place, right? Who cares about being a patient? It's not a privilege. It's something that you are forced to be. So you are not really a customer. You go there because you don't have any other choice. So in the strange place where doctors work, the doctors are the hosts, because they know what medicine is. They know what sickness, and they know the environment of the hospital. But also, the patient is a host of his physician. Because if the patient is not able to open up and tell his doctor that this is what I'm going through, this is my experience, this is my suffering, these are my symptoms. If he's not hospitable to the doctor is not able to help them. So hospitality works in two sides. The doctor is a host and a guest in the body of his patient. And the patient is hospitable to his doctor for whatever symptoms they have, but they are strangers in the world of medicine. I'll stop here. So I have so much, but and actually I am surprised that, let me now mention the name, Dr. Engelhardt, who passed away a couple months ago. God rest his soul. The way he sees moral strangeness is that we are strangers to each other, and we are only friends within our communities. And actually he takes the Good Samaritan proverb and explain it in a very weird way. While actually the Good Samaritan, who is the stranger, is Christ. This is the way we see him in the icons. He is the stranger, but he is the healer at the same time. So we cannot really be only moral strangers to each other. We are strangers, but we have to suffer through hospitality so that we can heal each other. And the healing happens to the doctor as much as it happens to the patient. Thank you very much.
Do I have time for one question or comment, and then we'll keep moving. And again, the discussion doesn't end here, so please find Father Luke after the set of presentations and chat during our break.
And please challenge me with all your questions. Doesn't mean that I have answers, but just I need the questions.
Anything from the floor? Please come up.
Thank you so much, Father. That was
Thank you.
very eye-opening. Sorry. Okay. I have a dilemma that I would love help with from you, Father, but everyone else as well. I work with a colorectal surgeon, a young man in his 40s who's been doing this for about 10 years now. And I assist him in the operating room. And more than once, he's a secular Jew. And more than once, he's initiated the conversation of, I don't believe in miracles. Do you really think they exist? And he knows that I'm a faithful Christian, and I say, yes, of course I believe in miracles. And he says, well, tell me then, what about the 30-year-old man that I just had to tell that he has terminal colorectal cancer, who has 2 children, who are at home, and has a wife? And on multiple occasions, he initiates this conversation. I feel like he's grappling with the concept of suffering. Yeah. And I've prayed about this for so long, but I don't know how to engage effectively with him so that, for us to understand this concept from a spiritual perspective, but how do we portray that to someone who doesn't see that view yet, but to be a healing presence to them?
I might leave it to more expert people who work with someone like this. But I would suggest, which I did not get to talk more about it, that we have to emphasize the vulnerability of physicians themselves. I did not talk, it was there, about the vulnerability of medicine as an enterprise, because there's a lot of uncertainty in medicine, and we don't know everything. And even the science that we prove today, in 10 years, we're going to change. Because the one example is the SIDS for kids who were sleeping on their tummies for a long time, and then the doctors discovered that this is what's causing them to die. So things change even in medicine. But the issue is what doctors in training are not talked about is that they are as vulnerable as their patients. And because of the way medicine is taught, that now death is our enemy, and we have to defeat death. And whenever the doctors reach to the point where they cannot do anything, they abandon their patients and throw it to palliative care physicians so that they can take care of the topic about stopping all kinds of treatment. So I think all doctors suffer with that. They have reasons for it. But the basic thing that we have to remind doctors in training is that the very first thing that moved them to become physicians is compassion. And at the time, they were not able to do anything but be present. So that's why you see how many doctors, to be admitted to medical school, they have to be volunteers in somewhere where they show they are compassionate people. That's right. They start at compassion, but compassion is squeezed out of them by the end of their training. And part of it because they at some point recognize that they have compassion and they recognize the vulnerability of the person and their own vulnerability at the time when they could not do anything. They volunteered in a hospice care facility, for instance, and were there just to read to a patient who was dying, right? By the end of their training, they forget about these experiences and try to think about medicine only in a mechanistic way, that he's the cause of this disease and this is what we're going to give to the patient. Re-emphasizing the vulnerability of doctors and showing that, and probably you know, the worst patient is a doctor, right? When they get sick, they are the worst patients because they are not well aware of their vulnerability from early on. And because he's in his 40s, I think it's going to take time before he can recognize his own failing body at some point. But the issue is so many doctors are recognizing that by going through addiction and suicide at some point because of how much the system is demanding on them. And because they think that they are not vulnerable, so they go to somewhere where they can vent out. And that's where addiction comes. And many of them commit suicide. I was told, I'm sorry, I'm going to take this 1 minute. So after I moved to my new parish, I met a guy during a funeral, and he calls me 2 days afterwards. And he said the guy who passed away in that funeral probably overdosed. But he had other issues. Then this guy I met there, he was his friend at the same office. And he calls me after 2 days. He says, I have a cousin who is a pain physician who just committed suicide, and he's in his 40s. He's probably overdosed. He has troubled marriage, and he has young kids and all these stuff. And he told me, I said, is that something was expected? And he said, oh, he was in addiction rehab for a couple times now. And when this cousin visited him, at the same table, there were sitting 5 doctors who were in addiction rehab. One is a neurosurgeon, one is pain doctor. So it's very well known in medical circles that is not talked about outside, that patients don't recognize the ordeal of becoming a patient. And that's what is so much demanding on them. Sometimes we have to remind patients that, come on, I'm a human being, you know? One time my wife is a geriatrician. I'm sorry, I'm going to. So her patient was dying, and she was initiating the talk. She's not a palliative care. She's only an internal medicine at the time. And she said, you know, we cannot do anything more for you. And the physician, the patient's family would say, and she probably was trying, she was tearing up just because she was compassionate to this family. And the patient family told her, oh, you have emotions about your patients? I imagine the family think that the doctor has no emotions. And she said, they told her, oh, probably your training is done for you to squeeze out compassion so you don't feel anything with your patients. But so that's painful, you know? But that's what the expectations of patients sometimes. And the system is really doing that. And that's why doctors are burnt out.
Thank you so much for
I'm
that
so sorry. It took so much.
Wonderful.